Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. Our hero Alvin has found that Diaspar is not the last inhabited place in the world. There is also the country of Lys, and he is now visiting. If there was any ambiguity about Alvin's position, his hosts were very careful not to remind him of it. He was free to go anywhere he wished in Airlie, the little village over which Seranus ruled, though that was too strong a word to describe her position. Sometimes it seemed to Alvin that she was a benevolent dictator, but at others it appeared that she had no powers at all. So far he had failed completely to understand the social system of Lys, either because it was too simple or else so complex that its ramifications eluded him. All he had discovered for certain was that Lys was divided into innumerable villages, of which Airlie was quite a typical example. Yet in a sense there were no typical examples, for Alvin had been assured that every village tried to be as unlike its neighbors as possible. It was all extremely confusing. Though it was very small and contained less than 1,000 people, Airlie was full of surprises. There was hardly a single aspect of life which did not differ even to such fundamentals as speech. Though it was very small and contained less than 1,000 people, Airlie was full of surprises. There was hardly a single aspect of life which did not differ from its counterpart in Diaspar. The differences extended even to such fundamentals as speech. Only the children used their voices for normal communication. The adults scarcely ever spoke, and after a while Alvin decided that they did so only out of politeness to him. It was a curiously frustrating experience to feel oneself enmeshed in a great net of soundless and undetectable words, but after a while Alvin grew accustomed to it. It seemed surprising that vocal speech had survived at all, since there was no longer any use for it, but Alvin later discovered that the people of Lys were very fond of singing, and indeed of all forms of music. Without this incentive, it was very likely that they would long ago have become completely mute. They were always busy, engaged on tasks or problems which were usually incomprehensible to Alvin. When he could understand what they were doing, much of their work seemed quite unnecessary. A considerable part of their food, for example, was actually grown and not synthesized in accordance with patterns worked out ages ago. When Alvin commented on this, it was patiently explained to him that people of Lys liked to watch things grow, to carry out complicated genetic experiments, and to evolve ever more subtle tastes and flavors. Airlie was famous for its fruit, but when Alvin ate some choice samples, they seemed to him no better than those he could have conjured up in Diaspar by no more than raising a finger. At first he wondered if the people of Lys had forgotten or never possessed the powers and machines which he took for granted and upon which all life in Diaspar was based. He soon found that this was not the case. The tools and the knowledge were there, but they were used only when it was essential. The most striking example of this was provided by the transport system, if it could be dignified with such a name. For short distances, people walked and seemed to enjoy it. If they were in a hurry or had small loads to move, they used animals which had obviously been developed for the purpose. The freight-carrying species was a low, six-legged beast, very docile and strong, but of poor intelligence. The racing animals were of a different breed altogether, normally walking on 4 legs, but using only their heavily muscled hind limbs when they really got up to speed. They could cross the entire width of Lys in a few hours, and the passenger rode in a pivoted seat strapped on the creature's back. Nothing in the world would have induced Alvin to risk such a ride, though it was a very popular sport among the younger men. Their finely bred steeds were the aristocrats of the animal world and were well aware of it. They had a fairly large vocabulary, and Alvin overheard them talking boastfully among themselves about past and future victories. When he tried to be friendly and attempted to join in the conversation, they pretended that they could not understand him, and if he persisted, would go bouncing off in outraged dignity. These two varieties of animals sufficed for all ordinary needs, and gave their owners a great deal of pleasure which no mechanical contrivances could have done. But when extreme speed was required, or vast loads had to be moved, the machines were there and were used without hesitation. Though the animal life of Lys presented Alvin with a whole world of new interests and surprises, it was the two extremes of human population range that fascinated him most of all. The very young and the very old, both were equally strange and equally amazing. Ehrlich's most senior inhabitant had barely attained his second century, and had only a few more years of life before him. When he had reached that age, Alvin reminded himself, his body would scarcely have altered, whereas this old man, who had no chain of future existences to look forward to as compensation, had almost exhausted his physical powers. His hair was completely white, and his face an unbelievably intricate mass of wrinkles. He seemed to spend most of his time sitting in the sun, or walking slowly round the village, exchanging greetings with everyone he met. As far as Alvin could tell, he was completely contented, asking no more of life, and was not distressed by its approaching end. Here was a philosophy so much at variance with that of Diospar as to be completely beyond Alvin's comprehension. Why should anyone accept death when it was so unnecessary, when you had the choice of living for 1,000 years, and then leaping forward through the millennia to make a new start in a world that you had helped to shape? This was one mystery he was determined to solve as soon as he had the chance of discussing it frankly. It was very hard for him to believe that Lys had made this choice of its own free will, if it knew the alternative existed. He found part of his answer among the children, those little creatures who were as strange to him as any of the animals of Lys. He spent much of his time among them, watching them at their play, and eventually being accepted by them as a friend. Sometimes it seemed to him that they were not human at all. Their motives, their logic, and even their language were so alien. He would look unbelievingly at the adults and ask himself how it was possible that they could have evolved from these extraordinary creatures who seemed to spend most of their lives in a private world of their own. And yet, even while they baffled him, they aroused within his heart a feeling he had never known before. When, which was not often but sometimes happened, they burst into tears of frustration or despair, their tiny disappointments seemed to him more tragic than man's long retreat after the loss of his galactic empire. That was something too huge and remote for comprehension, but the weeping of a child could pierce one to the heart. Alvin had met love in Diospar, but now he was learning something equally precious, and without which love itself could never reach its highest fulfillment, but must remain ever incomplete. He was learning tenderness. If Alvin was studying Lys, Lys was also studying him, and was not dissatisfied with what it found. He had been in Airlie for 3 days when Serranus suggested he might like to go further afield and to see something more of her country. It was a proposal he accepted at once, on condition that he was not expected to ride one of the village's prize racing beasts. "I can assure you," said Serranus with a rare flash of humor, "that no one here would dream of risking one of their precious animals. Since this is an exceptional case, I will arrange transport in which you will feel more at home. Hilvar will act as your guide, but of course you can go wherever you please." Alvin wondered if that was strictly true. He imagined there would be some objection if he tried to return to the little hill from whose summit he had first emerged into Lys. However, that did not worry him for the moment, as he was in no hurry to go back to Diospar, and indeed had given little thought to the problem after his initial meeting with Serranus. Life here was still so interesting and so novel that he was quite content to live in the present. He appreciated Serranus' gesture in offering her son as his guide, though doubtless Hilvar had been given careful instructions to see he did not get into mischief. It had taken Alvin some time to get accustomed to Hilvar, for a reason he could not very well explain to him without hurting his feelings. Physical perfection was so universal in Diaspar that personal beauty had been completely devalued. Men noticed it no more than the air they breathed. This was not the case in Lys, and the most flattering adjective that could be applied to Hilvar was homely. By Alvin's standards, he was downright ugly, and for a while he had deliberately avoided him. If Hilvar was aware of this, he showed no sign of it, and it was not long before his good-natured friendliness had broken through the barrier between them. The time was to come when Alvin would be so accustomed to Hilvar's broad, twisted smile, his strength, and his gentleness, that he could scarcely believe he had ever found him unattractive, and would not have had him changed for any consideration in the world. They left Airlie soon after dawn in a small vehicle which Hilvar called a ground car, and which apparently worked on the same principle as the machine that had brought Alvin from Diaspar. It floated in the air a few inches above the turf, and although there was no sign of any guide rail, Hilvar told him the cars could only run on predetermined routes. All the centers of population were linked together in this fashion, but during his entire stay in Lys, Alvin never saw another ground car in use. Hilvar had put a great deal of effort into organizing this expedition, and was obviously looking forward to it quite as much as Alvin. He'd planned the route with his own interests in mind, for natural history was his consuming passion, and he hoped to find new types of insect life in the relatively uninhabited regions of Lys which they would be visiting. He intended to travel as far south as the machine would take them, and the rest of the way they would have to go on foot. Not realizing the full implication of this, Alvin made no objection. They had a companion with them on the journey, Criff, the most spectacular of Hilvar's many pets. When Criff was resting, his 6 gauzy wings lay folded along his body, which glittered through them like a jeweled scepter. If something disturbed him, he would rise into the air with a flicker of iridescence and a faint whirring of invisible wings. Though the great insect would come when called, and would, sometimes, obey simple orders, it was almost wholly mindless. Yet it had a definite personality of its own, and for some reason was suspicious of Alvin, whose sporadic attempts to gain its confidence always ended in failure. To Alvin, the journey across Lys had a dreamlike unreality. Silent as a ghost, the machine slid across rolling plains and wound its way through forests, never deviating from its invisible track. It traveled perhaps 10 times as fast as a man could comfortably walk. Seldom indeed was any inhabitant of Lys in a greater hurry than that. They passed through many villages, some larger than Airlie, but most of them built along very similar lines. Alvin was interested to notice the subtle but significant differences in clothing and even physical appearance that occurred as they moved from one community to the next. The civilization of Lys was composed of hundreds of distinct cultures, each contributing some special talent toward the whole. The ground car was well stocked with Airlie's most famous product, a small yellow peach, which was gratefully received whenever Hilvar gave away some samples. He often stopped to talk to friends and to introduce Alvin, who never ceased to be impressed by the simple courtesy with which everyone used vocal speech as soon as they knew who he was. It must often have been very tedious to them, but as far as he could judge, they always resisted the temptation to lapse into telepathy, and he never felt excluded from their conversation. They made their longest pause at a tiny village almost hidden in a sea of tall golden grass, which soared high above their heads and which undulated in the gentle wind as if it was endowed with life. As they moved through it, they were continually overtaken by rolling waves as the countless blades bowed in unison above them. At first it was faintly disturbing, for Alvin had a foolish fancy that the grass was bending down to look at him, but after a while he found the continual motion quite restful. Alvin soon discovered why they had made this stop. Among the little crowd that had already gathered before the car came gliding into the village was a shy, dark girl whom Hilvar introduced as Nyara. They were obviously very pleased to see one another again, and Alvin felt envious of their patent happiness at this brief reunion. Hilvar was clearly torn between his duties as a guide and his desire to have no other company but Njara, and Alvin soon rescued him from his quandary by setting off on a tour of exploration by himself. There was not much to see in the little village, but he took his time. When they started on their way again, there were many questions he was anxious to ask Hilvar. He could not imagine what love must be like in a telepathic society, and after a discreet interval he broached the subject. Hilvar was willing enough to explain, even though Alvin suspected that he had made his friend interrupt a prolonged and tender mental leave-taking. In Liss, it seemed, all love began with mental contact, and it might be months or years before a couple actually met. In this way, Hilvar explained, there could be no false impressions, no deceptions on either side. Two people whose minds were open to one another could hide no secrets. If either attempted it, the other party would know at once something was being concealed. Only very mature and well-balanced minds could afford such honesty. Only love based upon absolute unselfishness could survive it. Alvin could well understand that such a love would be deeper and richer than anything his people could know. It could be so perfect, in fact, that he found it hard to believe that it could ever occur at all. Yet Hilvar assured him that it did, and became starry-eyed and lost in his own reveries when Alvin pressed him to be more explicit. There were some things that could not be communicated. One either knew them or one did not. Alvin decided sadly that he could never attain the kind of mutual understanding which these fortunate people had made the very basis of their lives. When the ground car emerged from the savannah, which ended abruptly as though a frontier had been drawn beyond which the grass was not permitted to grow, there was a range of low, heavily wooded hills ahead of them. This was an outpost, Hilvar explained, of the main rampart guarding Liss. The real mountains lay beyond, but to Alvin even these small hills were an impressive and awe-inspiring sight. The car came to a halt in a narrow, sheltered valley which still flooded but with the warmth and light of the descending sun. Hilvar looked at Alvin with a kind of wide-eyed candor which one could have sworn was totally innocent of any guile. "This is where we start to walk," he said cheerfully, beginning to throw equipment out of the vehicle. "We can't ride any further." Alvin looked at the hills surrounding them, then at the comfortable seat in which he'd been riding. "Isn't there a way around?" he asked, not very hopefully. "Of course," replied Hilvar, "but we're not going round. We're going to the top, which is much more interesting. I'll put the car on automatic so it will be waiting for us when we get down the other side." Determined not to give in without a struggle, Alvin made one last effort. "It'll soon be dark," he protested. "We'll never be able to go all that way before sunset." "Exactly," said Hilvar, sorting packages and equipment with incredible speed. "We'll spend the night on the summit and finish the journey in the morning." For once, Alvin knew when he was beaten. The gear that they were carrying looked very formidable, but though it was bulky, it weighed practically nothing. It was all packed in gravity-polarizing containers which neutralized the weight, leaving only inertia to be contended with. As long as Alvin moved in a straight line, he was not conscious that he was carrying any load. Dealing with these containers required a little practice, for if he attempted to make a sudden change of direction, his pack seemed to develop a stubborn personality and did its best to keep him on his original course until he had overcome its momentum. When Hilvar had adjusted all the straps and satisfied himself that everything was in order, they began to walk slowly up the valley. Alvin looked back wistfully at the ground car retracing its track and disappearing from sight. He wondered how many hours would elapse before he would again relax in its comfort. Nevertheless, it was very pleasant climbing upwards with the mild sun beating on their backs and seeing ever-new vistas which unfolded around them. There was a partly obliterated path which disappeared from time to time, but which Hilvar seemed to be able to follow even when Alvin could see no trace of it. He asked Hilvar what had made the path, and was told that there were many small animals in these hills, some solitary and some living in primitive communities which echoed many features of human civilization. A few had even discovered or been taught the use of tools and fire. It never occurred to Alvin that such creatures might be other than friendly. Both he and Hilvar took this for granted, for it had been so many ages since anything on earth had challenged the supremacy of man. They had been climbing for half an hour when Alvin first noticed the faint reverberating murmur in the air around him. He could not detect its course, for it seemed to come from no particular direction. It never ceased, and it grew steadily louder as the landscape widened around them. He would have asked Hilvar what it was, but it had become necessary to save his breath for more essential purposes. Alvin was in perfect health. Indeed, he had never had an hour's illness in his life. But physical well-being, however important and necessary it might be, was not sufficient for the task he was facing now. He had the body, but he did not possess the skill. Hilvar's easy strides, the effortless surge of power which took him up every slope, filled Alvin with envy, and a determination not to give in while he could still place one foot in front of the other. He knew perfectly well that Hilvar was testing him, and did not resent the fact. It was a good-natured game, and he entered into the spirit of it even while the fatigue spread slowly through his legs. Hilvar took pity on him when they had completed two-thirds of the ascent, and they rested for a while propped up against a westward-facing bank, letting the mellow sunlight drench their bodies. The throbbing thunder was very strong now, and although Alvin questioned him, Hilvar refused to explain it. It would, he said, spoil the surprise if Alvin knew what to expect at the end of the climb. They were now racing against the sun, but fortunately the final ascent was smooth and gentle. The trees which had covered the lower part of the hill had now thinned out as if they were too tired of the fight against gravity, and for the last few hundred yards the ground was carpeted with short, wiry grass on which it was very pleasant to walk. As the summit came in sight, Hilvar put forth a sudden burst of energy and went racing up the slope. Alvin decided to ignore the challenge. Indeed, he had no choice. He was quite content to plod steadily onward, and when he caught up with Hilvar to collapse in contented exhaustion by his side. Not until he had regained his breath was he able to appreciate the view spread out beneath him, and to see the origin of the endless thunder which now filled the air. The ground ahead fell away steeply from the crest of the hill, so steeply indeed that it soon became an almost vertical cliff. And leaping far out from the face of the cliff was a mighty ribbon of water, which curved out through space to crash into the rocks 1,000 feet below. There it was lost in a shimmering mist of spray, while up from the depths rose that ceaseless drumming thunder that reverberated in hollow echoes from the hills on either side. Most of the waterfall was now in shadow, but the sunlight streaming past the mountain still illuminated the land beneath, adding the final touch of magic to the scene. For, quivering in evanescent beauty above the base of the fall, was the last rainbow left on earth. And we'll continue Alvin in his tour of Lys next time.